Welcome to Community Chats, Community Living Toronto's podcast that deals with interesting ideas, people, and issues facing our community. Today I sat down with Tory, a name that truly needs no introduction. From leading our city through the challenges of the pandemic to decades of civic and philanthropic service, John has been a dedicated champion for building stronger and more inclusive communities. We spoke about his deep connection to the developmental services sector, to his ties to Community Living Toronto through many decades, and the perspective he brings from having family members with intellectual disabilities. He also shared what continues to inspire him and why he believes so strongly in the work that we do here. This was a meaningful conversation with someone whose leadership and support has both shaped our city as well as our organization in lasting ways. We are proud to now have John as a chair of our Patrons Council, and I really hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Tory, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure, Brad.
Good to see you. You've been involved, got a lot to talk about in the next 30 minutes or so, but people may be curious, what is your background? How did you get involved with Community Living Toronto? You've got a bit of a family background, and then I know that your Tory's has been a law firm that we've used many times, so there's a number of connections, but maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about why you were interested and why you accepted this offer to be the chair of our Patrons Council.
Well, as usual, Brad, dots are always connected, and the law firm ended up, I think, doing work for Community Living because of the involvement of members of my family before me, generations before me. But I will start off by saying that I think all volunteer engagement by people, or much of it, has to do with the example set by your own family and by previous generations showing how important they think volunteer community service is. And in my case, as you know, both of my grandmothers were involved in predecessor organizations to Community Living Toronto, and they were both involved for a reason, as often is the case. In the case of my paternal grandmother, whose name was Tory, Jean Tory, she was involved because she had a granddaughter, my cousin, who had quite a serious intellectual disability from birth. So she wanted to be supportive of her by volunteering for the predecessor organization to Community Living. And in the case of my maternal grandmother and grandfather, whose names were Howard and Helen Bacon, they were involved because their son, my uncle, was born, had an accident or whatever they call it at birth, an incident at birth that left him with a milder intellectual disability, but nonetheless one that that was serious. And so I think it was, first of all, that family example. And secondly, it was the fact that, like many families that are watching and many families that aren't watching, they've been touched by this. And so for me, it was the continuation of some involvement that my relatives had, but also it was, I obviously knew my cousin, who's passed away now, but she was the same age as me, who was intellectually disabled. And I knew, and not only did I know, but they used to ask me if I would, when I was like 10, 11, 12, 13 years old, help my uncle to learn to read, because he had a serious problem with that and never did really learn to read very much. So I can well remember sitting with him, with a book and going through helping him to read. So, and I said before, I wanted to tell you the story just in brief terms of what happened with his life in the end, because when my grandfather died, he never would have guessed that my uncle would have ever got married and had children. It just wasn't within the sort of context that anybody thought, but he did. And he found this wonderful woman who supported him. They had 4 wonderful children who today are children of accomplishment. And he ended up living a life that was just, what a lot of people would have dreamt about. And he did it, though, thanks to the support he had throughout from Community Living and organizations like that, but also from his own family, where they made it possible, including the wonderful woman that he married, who's still very much alive, who understood who he was, loved him for who he was, and supported him. And so these are all stories that can give people great hope about the life going forward of people that may have experienced or experience intellectual disability. So that's how I came to be involved, and I want to carry forward that work, and I hope maybe one of my children will do the same thing.
Yeah, and that would have been back in, I guess, the late 50s, early 60s, where you were doing some of that work, and the times were a lot different then. So you mentioned predecessor organizations, and the reason we don't refer to our name very often is because the R word was in our past, and now we're community living, and many organizations that we work with are moving towards the word inclusion around the type of support that they provide. So things change over time. What do you remember about back when you were doing that work, and how your uncle and cousin were treated, or what stood out to you at the time that either seemed unfair or that you just struck you as a 10-year-old kid
Well,
helping your uncle to read?
yeah,
Yeah.
what struck me as a 10-year-old kid with regard to my cousin, who was more, so, had a bigger disability, was the fact that it was just such a challenging life for her. I mean, even when she was in a family circumstance, it was a different kind of relationship she had with all of us. And I mean, nobody was doing anything wrong or acting in an incorrect way, but it's just natural that you behave differently. And I think
Right.
that what my parents tried to teach me and all of us, because it was a big family, I think there were 15 cousins, was to take her as she came and to treat her no differently than you treat anybody else. And she was a loving, wonderful person. My uncle, I just remember, I think it taught me a lot at a very young age about understanding that people had different, strengths and different attributes and different, sometimes disabilities. And, it made me, I don't know if it did at the time, but sure, now I look back and say, well, how blessed I was to be able to read when I was 12 and a lot younger than that, and to be able to help someone else who couldn't. But to have it
Yeah.
close to home like that, I think is an enriching kind of experience in your life, because it teaches you a lot about the fact that others don't have life the same way you do in many different respects. So it was very formative, I think, and our family, I think, as a whole family, huge family of people, learned in a good way how to address this in a way that was respectful and dignified and hopeful and
Yeah.
fun. And we did have that kind of fun with people who had some other issues in their lives we didn't have.
It's a good point you make around not really maybe realizing it at the time, but looking back, it influences, because when you're a kid and you're growing up, your world is, you don't know any different. It's just the world that you live in, right? So
Yeah.
those early involvements and those early, getting to meet people with intellectual disabilities as part of your family early, I'm sure that sort of shaped your view of the world and how society should help people that are maybe need more help or a little more vulnerable.
No question about that, Brad. I mean, I today, sort of look at all the different groups, and some have disabilities, others just have circumstances they ended up in that, create issues in their lives that are much different than issues most of us face. And it's made me much more understanding and compassionate, and frankly eager to learn. Like, I want to know, why and what can be done about it, and what are some of the problems with regard to how other people treat and how government and society treats
Yeah.
people that have these circumstances. And so I think it really helps to have that start at a young age, because it makes you more curious, but also much more understanding and compassionate.
Yeah. Um, Maybe just talk a little bit about, now you've had a very successful career. You have had very successful careers in a number of different domains. So you're well known in media. You were successful in business as CEO of Rogers and involved with other organizations. And you're a lawyer. And then you've become a pretty generous philanthropist and supporter of organizations like Community Living Toronto. How did it all sort of start for you? What was where did you go to school? What were your early sort of experiences that sort of gave you this varied career
Well, I
that
think
you've created?
most of what I've experienced that comes from taking advantage of opportunities and not being afraid, and also volunteering, comes, as I said, from learned experience, mostly within family. And I really believe that's important. I hope, and I can see great signs of encouragement that my kids, want to be involved as volunteers in the community. And I say every time I give a talk to students, and so much I often do, the most fulfilling work that I've done in a career that has spanned a number of different, professions and so on, is volunteer work. And so I would say that is a foundation for all of this, and that people should, as much as they possibly can, volunteer for something. It doesn't matter what it is, something you have a passion for, or a family connection to, or whatever. I was lucky enough to go to a school called UTS, which is a very academic school. And then I went to the U of T, like lots of other people, and I went to Osgoode Hall at York University for my law school. So my education was, ordinary, but I was lucky to have it. And
Yeah.
I think after that, though, what really was the key is back to where I started a minute ago, which is I volunteered in politics when I was 14, and literally, it's not because I was some sort of a policy-driven egghead at that age. Somebody said to me when I like to go to a party on a Friday night, and if I could go if I joined the Young Progressive Conservatives for $1. And so I did. And I went to the party and I had a good time, but also then we ended up volunteering in political campaigns starting then. And of course, it allowed me, and I will say that that form of volunteering, and it doesn't have to be politics, it could be community living, it could be anything. When you come into contact with other people, when you are given responsibility by a volunteer organization, because they're always short of people,
Yeah.
it teaches you early on about responsibility and about it. It creates a network of other friends you have beyond the ones you meet in your neighborhood or at school. And so I was blessed by all of that. And my involvement in politics got deeper and deeper. And I ended up, sort of running other people's campaigns when I was 20, because I'd been around for such a long time. But the rest of it, in terms of my jobs, I would only say to people, especially younger people and parents, because parents are often saying, oh, you've got a job, don't look for another one, or don't change jobs.
Right.
I never changed jobs because I set out to do so, but I changed jobs because I accepted opportunities people presented to me.
As they
And
came
I will
along.
tell
Yeah.
you, yeah, in hindsight, I am so glad I did. Not because I was tired of the things I was doing when I left, but because it gave me new opportunities to learn new things. And I tell the student groups that I talk to as well, every time I walked into a new job, when I first did a talk show, when I first became a CEO, when I first walked into the mayor's office, I was really scared. And I was scared in that way human beings would be. And they said, I've never done this before. I've never been a mayor before. I've never done a talk show before. I've never, been a CEO before. But if you get good people around you, you listen, you put your head down and work hard, you learn how to do these things. And so I would just say I was blessed to have, as you mentioned, 4 or 5 different careers, all of which were interesting, any of which I would go back to in a second, because they were, I didn't leave any of them sort of saying, God, I'm glad to be rid of that.
Yeah.
Maybe being leader of the opposition at Queen's Park. And that's only because, well, it's a very debilitating job in its own way, because you're expected to be negative, meaning criticize the government.
Yeah.
And no matter what you do, some days somebody will say you weren't negative enough on them, and other days people will say you were too negative. So you just can't win. But having said that, I would even go back to that job, because that's the job you have to have before you can have a chance to become premier, which I
Right.
wasn't
True.
successful at doing,
True.
but I tried.
True. What interesting there. So, we did a podcast a number of weeks ago with Vashi, who we both know, and she talked about the same thing that you just mentioned around going into each of your jobs and new opportunities and being afraid. And she talked about she still gets nervous. Less so, but every time she goes on air or every time she does something or speaks in front of a group. And, I would look at her and I would look at you and go, man, you guys have it nailed. Like how can you still be afraid or still be nervous about stuff that comes along? And what we talked about was many of the people that we work with, people with an intellectual disability, you wake up every day and you go into a world that can seem scary. People, because you might look different, you may act different, you may have different experiences. What do you have any tips or suggestions around how people can face or deal or manage that, whether it's anxiety or fear or sort of overcome it to push through?
Well, first of all, I would say, because I think it's a very valid point. First of all, I would say to people, never think you've done away with that. I'll call it an anxiety, fear, call it whatever you want.
Yeah.
I suspect if you ask professional athletes, most of them before they step on the ice or step on the basketball court are anxious. And that's that sort of positive nervous tension that causes you to do better, because you perform better. But in terms of trying to minimize that, I would just say, I always say to people, remain humble, but be confident. And I think, it's when you get carried away with yourself and think that somehow, you do have it nailed and you can get up in front of anybody anytime and speak
Right.
and sound like Winston Churchill, you probably are going to give a bad speech. And
Yeah.
I think if you're sort of humble because you realize you're there and it's a privilege to be there, and that, the people are probably not judging you, they're just interested in what you have to say, and you have the confidence of probably knowing what you're talking about, but never to the extent that you know it all. I just think it's that combination of humility, which means you are a little bit tense, and confidence. Because I'm the same as Vashi. Every time I give a speech, I never take it for granted and stand up on a podium in front of 5 people or 5,000 people. And same when
Right.
I go on TV. I'm keyed up enough to keep my wits about me and to always remain sort of humble, but with enough confidence that you can, get started. And of course, I think Vashi would agree, once you get started on a speech, and I find, and again, we're into sort of, speaking lessons now, but I find
Yeah.
that if I sort of joke a little bit with the audience when I start, that relaxes me, but it also relaxes them. And then once we've shared a laugh about something, even if it's somebody sitting in the front row, then it's easier for you to get on with what you have to say. And I also watch the audience very carefully. And if I see that they look
It's
like they're getting
important.
bored,
Yeah.
people are yawning with very open mouth yawns, I sort of know that it's probably time to wrap it up.
Yeah.
or switch
Fair.
topics or something.
Fair enough. Very good. A good tip. I've heard many speakers who I think could have used that advice, where it
Yeah.
just tends to go on. So, want to switch a little bit, and this is sort of for me. So, you started out early in your career working for Bill Davis, and I'm a fan of Bill Davis. I'm working through Steve Pakin's book. It's a rather thick book,
Yes, it is.
and he covers a lot of ground, but it's a great read. So, I'll just tell you, my dad worked as the chauffeur for the president of Shell Canada in the 80s. He started out in computers. He did not have sort of a Bill Gates kind of trajectory in computers. It was back when computers took
Yeah.
rooms and ran with little punch cards. And it wasn't his favorite thing, but he pivoted at some point to being the driver, and he's a helper in that. So one of the benefits of that was sometimes we would get the Shell Canada CFL Argos tickets at the 50-yard line. We were there one day, and Bill Davis was behind, and he, traditional or typical Bill Davis pose, pipe, sitting there casually, a couple of OPP guys with them, and I was enthralled. I'm 8 or 10 or whatever, and I sort of gave him a look, and he saw me looking at him, and he just gave me a little nod with his pipe, right? And again, this was a long time ago, and I've carried it with me, and I've since been a fan of his. What was that like working with Bill Davis in those areas where it was the big blue machine, and he had an agenda to grow the province and the education system and that? What was that like?
Well, I mean, for me, it was dizzying in some respects because when I went to work for him, while I'd been involved and knew him, and that's why I ended up as his principal secretary when I was 26. And it was a
Right.
big responsibility for me to have, and a bit dizzying in the sense you thought, oh my goodness. Again, I was scared when I walked into that job,
Yeah.
first day thinking. In fact, my grandmother, Tory, the one I mentioned earlier on, she called me to say, why would Bill Davis want your advice when it was announced on the radio that I would go to be his top aide? And she was, she wasn't being mean. She was just sort of saying, well, I was very young and all of this. But you know what? He was the kind of guy that just like he looked at you with his pipe in his mouth at the football game was no different when he was in his office. There he is in probably what is arguably the second most powerful position in the country. And he never, let his feet leave the ground. He never was unbalanced in how he looked at things. And to me, I really believe whether it's in public office or as a CEO or as the head of community living, that kind of balance, that kind of, he was a humble man. You never saw him do anything that was pretentious. That kind of a balance, though, and feet on the ground is so important to be able to carry out a job where, no matter what you do, it's not going to be 100%, with the concurrence of everybody. And it's not necessarily even going to be 100% right. You do your best. And he very much looked at the world that way. He was the ultimate pragmatist, which I became, I think, thanks to sort of just working so closely with him. I mean, I have ideological values and or not ideological, they're just values that I try to, do in my public and in my private life as best one can. But I don't have any rigid ideologies that sort of tell me, well, you can't do this if you have people that need help or that need a certain kind of solution. So, but it was wonderful to work with him. I think, Brad, I can honestly say, I don't think I ever saw him like yell at anybody or raise his voice. I mean, he occasionally would bite down hard on that pipe to the point where you would think it might crack into 1,000 pieces when he was not happy, but never like he would just say, well, okay, let's go back to the beginning of this and see what we need to do to fix it. And I went through some crises and some difficult circumstances with him and never saw him, lose his cool. And again, I think that when you're in a position of leadership like you are and like I have been, staying cool. I mean, this is a large part of it, but you have to sort of train yourself to stay cool because human nature is, you're going to get wound up about things. Little kids are irritating you or something like that. We all see it. And you have to just stay cool because people expect you to be cool and you have to be cool in order to make the right decisions. But he was cool more than anything else. And just even the way he said hello to you, where he kind of nodded and that made you feel recognized, but it didn't have him coming and throwing his arms around you. That was him. I mean, and he stayed cool.
Excellent. That's true. And we're in an era where the rage and outrage is more valued or seems to be, or certainly gets more attention and clicks, I guess, than just being calm and carrying on.
The other thing he had, Brad, frankly, was a huge amount of compassion. And I'm lucky to have that too, probably, again, picked up from, my relatives and from my family experiences and from him and people like that who mentored me. But, you have to care about other people, and you have to care about other people no matter what job you're in. You care about your staff and your clients. I cared about all the people of Toronto when I was mayor. I honestly did. I mean, like if there was you'd wake up every morning in that job, and sometimes in the middle of the night you'd be woken up to say there was a bad fire or
Yeah.
somebody murdered or some terrible thing that had happened, and your initial reaction is to have a real feeling in your heart of compassion for the people directly involved and those indirectly involved. And you have to have that. You have to have that even if you're, and should have it. Some CEOs, I think one of the things they're lacking quite often is that kind of compassion that sort of says they care deeply about their staff in particular, the people who work with them, but also about their customers. And you want them to be
Yeah.
happy and to be not angry. And I think it's another fundamental kind of trait of leadership that he had, and that I think is one that is essential.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. A couple things, and I just one of the most challenging times that we went through as an organization was COVID. Right, we had two of our staff pass away. They got COVID and passed away. We had 5 individuals that we support pass away, and those first few months, February, March, I guess March and forward of 2020 were really difficult. You were mayor at the time, and we were having to figure out what this COVID was, and we were talking to other organizations, a group from New York, and they got it first in North America, and they were painting pretty desperate pictures. So we were terrified. And I will say for the rest of my career that one of the big things that motivated me and just inspired me was the way people that worked for us came to work every single day in very trying circumstances, didn't know where things were going to go, didn't know how this illness was spread, and then and you're coming to a job that's difficult anyway at times. One of the things that was really inspirational for me and for us at the time was you as mayor, coming on as you're doing now, just sort of talking us through, calmly explaining what you knew. I remember your hair got longer and and all that.
Ponytail.
And a ponytail. I know. I never got to that point, but thank you for your leadership during that time, because it really meant a lot as somebody who was also working with a bunch of people that were really trying hard to keep the city going, and keeping the people that we were support safe and supported didn't have the opportunity to not go to work, right? People had to show up. So thank you for your leadership during that time.
I was just doing my job, Brad, and I don't mean that in any kind of artificial humility. I was doing my job, and you don't think these kinds of things are going to be thrust upon you, but they were. And again, back to what I said earlier, I tried to stay cool, and I had a great big team of people working with me.
Yeah, the city was great.
A close-in team: Fire Chief Peg, Joe Cressy, the councillor, and Eileen DeVilla, the medical officer of health. And what we did, first of all, we focused on the main thing we had to do. We believed in our respective jobs, which is to protect life and to save lives. I was told at the beginning of COVID that 15,000 people would die in Toronto if we didn't do something. And
Wow.
as in the end, I don't think people realize 6,000 people in Toronto did die from COVID, including the people you mentioned in your own team. 6,000 people. But so we came to work every day. And again, another point in all this debate about people going on about what a hardship it is to go to the office, and whatnot. I mean, all of the people you mentioned, and the firefighters and the transit workers and the grocery store employees and the police officers and so on, they came to work every day. People who picked up the solid waste and all that, they came to work every day, and they had no choice. And they were worried, and we were worried for them, because we didn't really know for the longest time. People who get mad at the judgment calls we made, during COVID, don't really remember necessarily, nor would they. I don't expect they would. We didn't know. I mean, we initially started off, you might remember, taping off playground areas and that kind of thing. And why did we do that? Because people believed that if you went and touched a piece of playground equipment someone else had touched that had COVID, you'd get it. Well, it turns out that wasn't true. And at the beginning, people frowned on masks. Well, it turns out masks were actually quite valuable to stop the spread. So we all sort of did our best. But it was a team effort, but it was a terrible time. I mean, the number of people and I know that lost relatives and couldn't say goodbye to them. Things like that went on in their lives. And then the thing we focused on every single day, I can tell you, we talked about it, was the loneliness and the isolation of people who either were people that had a disability of some kind and were used to constant support that couldn't be delivered in the same way, or that were just seniors that lived alone and were used to going to a seniors club or having somebody check in or bring them food. And so we paid a lot of attention to that beyond trying to control the spread of the disease, because that was just about compassion for human beings. So it was a tough time. But,
it was.
As usual, from bad times, you learn a lot from them. And I think it made you and me and others better people for other circumstances that will present
Yeah.
themselves. Hopefully nothing like that. But I mean,
No, true.
and
True.
for me, it was the most, trying to think, I felt the true sense of public service during that period of time because I knew people were looking to me. And the reason I went on television every morning, quite frankly, Brad, I was on television every single morning at 6:30
Yeah. Yeah.
answering questions about COVID. And the fact is, if you went back and looked, I was answering the same questions every day because people were asking the same questions every day. And I
Yeah.
gave basically the same answers, and they changed from time to time a bit as we learned more.
Yeah.
But all that it was really about was that people saw their mayor, who is just the leader of the city, there answering questions as best he could, trying to provide some reassurance and some comfort that we were on top of this as best we could be. And that's what I thought one of my most important jobs was, to be on television so people could see that I was on the job and that I was trying my best to deal with this, but also to reassure them.
Well, yeah, and it really had that effect. It's sort of calming and reassuring, and there was sort of this routine every day, right? You watch you at 6:30 in the morning, and then the premier would come on later in the morning, and then the prime minister would come on, and we really felt supported going through that.
Well,
So
the other thing
uh,
is we worked well together. I mean, it was
worked
one of
well
those times
together. That
when,
was so important.
there were days when you think, well, they should be doing more of this or less of that, but you just didn't say it. And you'd say it privately if you thought you had to, but we worked really well because we knew the public were not going to not going to put up with, nor should they, any kind of fooling around about who was responsible for what. We just knew we had to get the job done together, and we did our best. And it wasn't perfect, but there's things you could look at in hindsight and say you shouldn't have done this or you should have done that. But I mean, hindsight's always 20/20, as they say.
Yeah, true. Two more questions. I want to end by asking you in a second what your view of how do you define belonging, or what has been what's important to you around belonging. It's sort of a question we ask people that come on this podcast. But before doing that, you were mayor. There's speculation that you may run again. Have you decided? Are you gonna run for mayor?
No, I haven't decided. It's a big decision, Brad. That's why it isn't one of those cavalier kinds of things that you just say, sure, why not? I take it more seriously than that for myself and my own life, but I think I'm entitled to do that, as we all are. But
Yes.
Secondly, you have to. I think you have to believe in your heart that you'd be the best at this point in time for the city, in terms of the kind of leadership it needs to deal with some of the challenges that we face. And so I'm taking it seriously. The election is still just about a year away, so it's not like it's happening next week. So
Right.
I'm thinking about it. I'm being encouraged to think about it. I love the job, and I left it in circumstances people are familiar with because I tried to handle a personal situation, my personal life, in an honorable way, so as not to take away from the office or distract
Mhm.
from the job. And some people disagree with that and say I shouldn't have done that, but shouldn't have resigned. I mean, so anyway, we are where we are, and I'm
Yeah.
thinking about it, and I realize that there's a time that comes in the new year where I have to decide, and it's about public service. I mean, at the end of the day,
Yeah.
I think I was born to do a degree of public service. You're put on the earth for a reason, and in my case, I think a lot of it has to do with public service, and so that's what makes me, I love the city, and I've spent 12 of my years in public service, and
Right.
I still have more to give. And so whether you give this way or you give some other way is just something I have to sort out.
Right. Well, I did not think I'd get an answer, and we're not a
No,
political
well,
sort of
because there is
podcast,
one.
but I think I would be remiss if I didn't at least
No, I
ask to
understand.
give you the opportunity to break
I
that,
Yeah.
break that here. But thanks for that. So belonging, what does belonging mean to you?
Well, belonging to me means that in many ways, in your different ways in your life, in different circumstances, you're getting a hug. And you know what people say, a hug. Well, I mean, sometimes the
Yeah.
hug can mean that you have a proper place to live. Sometimes a hug can mean a hug. Sometimes a
Yeah.
hug can mean that somebody's going to help you get the dignity of having a job. Which for people that are clients of community living can be more challenging in terms of finding one, let alone they can do it. I mean, in many cases, but they got to find the right one. Um,
Yeah.
and I felt, when you mentioned earlier on that I went to a lot of events in the city as mayor, I went, because I enjoyed it and I love meeting people, but I went as much as anything else because I wanted to show my respect for all the different communities that exist in the city, because I think
Hmm.
they're,
Hmm.
when I say longing for, it's too strong a word, but I think they thrive on getting some respect because we all do. And so
Yeah.
I think it's about respecting people. It's about, and I'm worried, to be frank, whether it has to do with people with disabilities or people from different backgrounds, that we're losing a bit of that very special sauce that Toronto had and has
Yeah.
and should have, where we know that what sets us apart from just other cities is respecting each other and respecting everybody. So
Yeah.
I just think belonging, means that we make every effort to make sure that people feel like they belong, they feel included, and that is all elements of life. And that can be as simple as a physical hug too. But, the hug can be the metaphorical hug where it's about a job, it's about how you live, it's about people checking in on you, it's about people supporting you in different ways. My helping my uncle to read, which I'll be honest was something my grandmother asked me to do, but my helping my uncle to read when I was 12 and he was probably 30, 35, I hope made him feel belonging, a sense of belonging in our family. And maybe broader than that. But, these are small things, but they're big in the context of things. So I just think it's a really good word for us to think about all the time. Do we make other people that we live next to, that we work next to, that we see, in our daily travels, feel like they belong, feel included, feel respected? Because if we can do that with everybody, and it's a tall order, then we can have a place to live that is very special. It's never going to be perfect because there's always people who, for one reason or another, don't act or can't act that way, but it's sure going to go a long way to have a happy place, because human beings put together by the millions, it produces issues. I mean, it just does.
Yes.
And so, you got to work at it, and that's making people feel like they belong. I think that goes a long way.
That's great. John, thank you for your support, for your work with the city and your leadership roles, but also thank you on behalf of Community Living for the role that you've played on our Patrons Council for, I think it's 25, 26 years. But the last year as chair, you've really helped us out, and we appreciate everything that you do for us.
Well, I appreciate all that you and your team do, because I've seen it in action. And people who haven't seen it, I've often said that if people, for example, went for a ride along, every single citizen with the police, they'd have a better understanding of what the police do. If every single person could go to one of your programs, one of your community, the houses that group houses and so on, they would have a better idea both of the needs of the clients, but also of the wonderful, compassionate, balanced, caring, competent work done by the team that you lead. And so, and it's out of sight a lot of the time. And that's fine. People aren't looking for glory, but they should get some recognition. And certainly they have it from me. And it motivates me to continue to do what little I do for you, but I hope it helps.
Well, the nice thing is we have a great volunteer department, and people can come help out and help in different ways. So good pitch. Thanks for that. John, thanks again.
Thank you, Brad, very much.
Thank you for listening, watching, and sharing. We release a new episode of Community Chats on the 15th and the 30th of each month, so don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date.